reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here, and we're talking today about light AT guns, specifically the artillery section option. We're not going to talk that much about vehicles today, as we'll talk about best guns for your vehicles in a future video. But today we're taking a look at this gun. Now, I bring up this guy because this was one of the first models I ever bought. When I first started in bolt action, I started collecting models. I decided to collect Poland because I believe in playing the game on hard mode, obviously. And I collected a Polish HQ section. I collected a couple of infantry blisters, which were loads of fun to paint because I just love painting great coats, to be honest. They're really, really fun. I got some cavalry and I got this AT gun. And I loved using it. I've always loved using it, but I'll be completely honest with you, it was not particularly effective in second edition. And I ended up switching to traditional field howitzers and anti-air guns pretty much exclusively within the first couple of months. But I'm not gonna lie, I've always loved them. I've always loved the look of them, the feel of them. They were very prolific across World War II, even in this lower, lighter caliber, about 37 to 47 millimeters or so, depending on which nation you're talking about. So I want to do a deep dive to see how effective they actually are in the game. And now that we're in third edition and we have the ability to run them the way that they were run historically, which is more than one at a time, we'll see how effective they are. So to start off with, like we've been doing for a bunch of other weapon systems, because I want to be fair, we're going to be looking at them from a lot of different angles. We're going to look at their range and rate of fire, the opportunity cost and ability to maximize your investment, their ability to generate pins, their ability to generate damage, because those are not the same thing. And there's going to be some math deep diving going in on that one. We're going to talk about them as objective holders. So just, plop them on an objective and let them fight, because they can, in fact, hold objectives in second and third edition. We'll talk about them as a potential unit for giving the ambush order and whether that makes them perhaps a little more effective, a little more appealing. We'll talk about target prioritization, how to get the most out of these things, and then we'll talk a little bit near the end about changes that I would make. So for starters, in terms of their range and rate of fire, or ROF, they're fine. They're pretty standard for heavy weapons. They get one attack, so it's one of those one dice. Some people might say, it's either going to be really great or it's really going to suck, right? Because you either hit or you miss. There's no leeway, no chance like you have with, say, an autocannon or a heavy machine gun, which are also light, also heavy weapons, but roughly comparable in cost to what you might expect for a unit that would have them, but they get more than one shot and thus are more likely to get a hit, at least one hit every round. In terms of cost, they're very comparable in cost to a light howitzer. In second edition, they cost exactly the same as a light howitzer. In third edition, if you buy the gun shield, they cost the same as a light howitzer, as a general rule. And then they're comparable or higher in cost than a light anti-aircraft gun. Second edition, they cost the same as a light AA gun. In third edition, the light AA gun got dropped down to 35 points, which I have so many questions about. But it was definitely one of the first things I noticed when I started looking through the units in the armies. I was like, wow, okay, light AA guns, good to know. Gonna grab a bunch of those, and I did. But the result is that since it has a comparable to higher cost than all of these, and a higher cost in general than multiple rocket launchers, only because multiple rocket launchers tended to be used inexperienced. With the recent errata in third edition, we'll see if we see them more at regular to take advantage of spotters. But in general, we've seen them be roughly a higher cost than rocket launchers. And because they can only fire direct, it's not like you have as many targets you could potentially shoot at, like you do with a howitzer or a multiple rocket launcher. The result is a lot of people from a range and rate of fire would say it's relatively easy for a mortar to pick you off. It's relatively easy for vehicles to work around you. Maybe not so effective. The opportunity cost really begins to hurt when you start breaking them down by comparison to other stuff, right? So like we've already talked about how they're the same or more than other light style guns. So obviously they're going to be a cheaper and in that sense better investment than a heavy AT gun or a super heavy AT gun. But when you look at them even compared to, a 50 points regular light AT gun compared to an infantry anti-tank weapon, there are some legitimate questions, right? I mean, for 10 points more, an American could buy a bazooka and they get better mobility. They get admittedly only 2 bodies instead of 3. They're not getting the gun shield. We'll talk about the gun shield more a little bit later. But they get mobility, they get increased penetration. While yes, a bazooka technically has half the range, it also doesn't suffer a long range penalty to its damage potential. So while it doesn't reach quite as far as a light AT gun, it is more effective than a light AT gun when it is in range by a pretty handy margin. The bazooka team has the ability to move in and out of ruins much more easily because they don't have to worry about just deploying in them. Like there's a lot of stuff that you can take advantage of, and obviously with something like an AT rifle or a Soviet dog mine or something like that, then you're really talking about value by comparison to the light AT gun. I do think there are a couple cases where if you were looking at an infantry anti-tank weapon, you might consider taking a light AT gun. So, for example, this right here, this is the picture here is of the Italian Elefantino painted up by Warlord Games on their website. Italians, I don't think get much beyond the AT rifle, which is a fantastic anti-tank weapon in and of itself, but it's mostly a pin generator. We're going to talk about AT guns, AT rifles in a couple weeks. But one might consider taking a light AT gun if one actually wanted to do vehicle removal, because AT rifles are fantastic, but the stats on them for actual vehicle removal are pretty bad. So if that's what you really needed in your army and you didn't just need another pin generator and slight remover of infantry, one might consider taking one, right? If one was looking at a Panzerschreck, 80 points for a Panzerschreck team for slightly better damage output with worse range and only 2 bodies instead of 3, one might consider saving quite a few points by taking a light AT gun instead of a Panzerschreck, right? You lose the mobility, but maybe you make up for it with the range. I don't know. That all depends. The opportunity cost is also pretty bad when you compare it to armored vehicles. While yes, you can take 1 or 2 of these typically for the same cost as an armored vehicle with a light AT gun. An armored vehicle with an autocannon is typically only slightly more expensive, and they're generally much better. So because of that, 2nd and 3rd edition, we tended to see light AT guns not being a reliable means of anti-vehicle firepower. We tended to see those fall more on the shoulders of infantry teams and armored vehicles instead. And finally, for only 20 to 25 points more, 25 more points in 2nd edition and 20 more points in 3rd edition. So the cost actually got a little bit better in 3rd edition. The medium anti-tank gun, for those who could take it, was a pretty good upgrade for the points. You were still only getting 3 guys. The resilience factor was the same, but the added 12 inches of range and the added damage potential meant this thing could really open cans pretty easily. And it was a good counter to the light armor that we tend to see across the table. Even at its longer range, it's still a 50-50 chance you're getting to roll for damage, right, on the damage chart. So, because of that, I think from an opportunity cost, I think it was a little bit lacking by comparison to the other options. It needed something else to really encourage you to say, I'm going to take this over a lighter medium howitzer, over an anti-aircraft gun, over just taking more infantry or something like that. Talking about pin generation, it does D2 pins on a hit. Now, there are some people who, when they see D2 pins, will talk about getting the number 2. And I'm one of those people hitting the boards on the internet saying, you really should be careful about using that as your base metric because it isn't true, okay? Half the time you're getting 1, okay, and not 2. So looking at 2nd edition, if you assume roughly 5s to hit, which in my experience was pretty common, between long-range penalties, pins on the unit, cover before the enemy, 5s was pretty reasonable. Okay, you could plan on getting to 5s roughly-ish with a unit if you ran your cards right. And if that's the case, you were only hitting, assuming even that you got off 6 shots during the game and a mortar didn't have your name on it before you got your value out, you were looking about 2 hits per game, dealing, maybe 2 to 3 pins on average, which for a 50-point unit is not that great. Okay, it's not horrible, but it's not that great. In 3rd edition, it gets slightly better because you get the anti-tank gun general bonus that whenever you're using a fire or an ambush order, which is most of the ones you would want to be using with an AT gun, you get up to that 3+ to hit because you get that added +1. And in general, I think you can probably plan on roughly 3s to 4s to hit. It might jump into 5s, but I think we can plan on roughly 3s to 4s That means at least you're getting 3 to 4 hits per game, which is about 3 to 8 pins per game, which is not horrible. I think in that sense, that extra +1 to hit does increase the value a bit for the third edition light AT gun from a pins perspective, and it does make it a little more justifiable. On any unit, being able to do 4 to 5, 5 to 6 pins on average in a given game is actually pretty solid. You're also a lower target priority, which means in general, you're probably going to have less pins. And this is the nice thing. Even if you're using it to camp an objective, which means a mortar might look at you and say, hey, they don't really want to be moving around. This is a priority target. If you're also camping an objective with, say, a 5-man regular infantry squad with double light machine guns, they might look at that 5-man LMG squad and think, that's actually more important than one of these. The light AT gun, it's only one shot. You might miss. We might not be in a nice line of fire for him. He can't easily redeploy in order to do stuff, which means I think on the order of targets that are being shot at, you might spend more of the game, at least half the game, possibly with no pins on you, because you just weren't as important as something else, which is really good for making sure that you get your shots out every turn and getting a little bit more value back. So in that sense, that actually might help you with your own pin generation, because you're more likely to pass your own order tests and you're more likely to hit, which is pretty cool. Looking at damage potential. Obviously, it's going to change a bit, and this is where we start getting into some heavy math. So you're a pen +4 at up to 24 inches. It goes down to pen +3 at beyond 24 inches and up to 48. Now, all of this changes if you're running a Panzerbusch, right, which is present for the Germans. And I'm really sorry if I said that wrong. Where if you can get to 12 inches away from somebody, you're looking at a pen +6. That's Panzerschreck levels of danger, heavy AT gun levels of danger, which is pretty good. You're back to the pen +4 at up to 24 inches, but you're down to pen +2 at 48 inches. In general, I tend to see this as a negative, because on something that does not easily move up, I think the Panzerbusch is not going to find itself at 12 inches away from a target unless they're in a lot of trouble. So I wouldn't personally use that, especially since, remember, in 3rd edition especially, if you're playing 3rd edition, you're not allowed to fire an armor-piercing round at an infantry section, which means if an infantry section is coming close to you, looking potentially to assault and move you clean off of that objective, you're not going to be getting the benefit of that pen +6. You're going to be firing a high explosive round, which is only a pen +1 with a 1-inch template. And it's going to be the same whether you're at long range or up close and personal. So it really only helps you against vehicles, and most vehicles are not going to want to get within 12 inches unless they're going to march right up to you, unleash a lot of machine guns, at which point you might lose the squad entirely. So, I think the Panzerbusch is much more useful on vehicles. Not so sure how useful it is for, for an artillery choice. If you like it, go ahead and take it. That's fine. In 2nd edition, though, what this practically means is you were looking at roughly 2 hits, as we mentioned before, with hitting on 5s. That's roughly 1 wound per game, which is not very good. Okay. In 3rd edition, because you're getting 3 to 4 hits, it's closer around 2 wounds, which comes out to about 1 to 2 wounds past cover, depending on whether or not you're using ambush orders or, various and sundry other things to mitigate cover benefits. It all depends on how that works. But at the very least, for being the same cost as it was in 2nd edition, I think it's fair to say the value goes up for the damage potential of the light AT gun in 3rd edition, which I think is good. And not particularly surprising, because you're getting that +1 to hit for free. If you're firing the high explosive rounds, you're looking at roughly about 2 to 4 hits, depending on, 2nd edition, 3rd edition, what your hit modifiers are. Of course, it's slightly easier to do hits in 2nd edition with the high explosive damage, because you're just ignoring those cover negative penalties. So it's slightly easier to get closer to that 3+ to hit than it is the 4+ to hit. But the result is, regardless of whether you're using 2nd or 3rd, you're looking at about 1 to 3 wounds. And then in 3rd edition, there might be cover saves off of that because you're not firing indirect. But at the very least, it's about 1 to 3, which is not horrible. For objective holding, 3 men costing about 50 points is pretty average. It's not horrible. Mortars are around that range. Machine gun teams are around that range. So, obviously, your light guns are roughly around the same range. So this is pretty normal. Okay, it's not a horrible cost for an objective holding unit. The fact that they have to take a gun shield is helpful, kind of. In 2nd edition, it meant that there was an increased difficulty of +1 to wound you, which was quite nice. So your regulars were treated as veterans if you were being fired at from the front. In 3rd edition, it counts as a 5+ cover save. which is helpful if you're not in cover. And that is advantageous because you might want them, say, peeking out from behind a building, but still being beyond the building so you can get that nice line of fire going down, say, a road, right? Or something like that. So you may not want them necessarily to be in cover with the gun being obscured and the crew being obscured and stuff like that. But at the same time, it also means that you're either paying for the gun shield and getting value out of the gun shield, at which point it's only a 5+ save, which is not very good. It means you can take roughly 4 wounds against the unit instead of 3, which is not great. And if you do decide to deploy it in a better form of cover, like say behind a stone wall, you're paying 5 points for a gun shield that you're not using, right? There's no extra or added benefit for doing that. And so that's helpful-ish, maybe not the greatest. It all depends. Okay. It is a low profile weapon. One of the reasons why I've been showing various different nations AT guns in this is that you can see they sit pretty low to the ground, which means you could hide behind almost literally anything and get cover off of it, which is really good, and quite advantageous. So there's that. And because it's a light AT gun, the crew themselves can move it, which means no tow is required. Now, in reality, these guns were about 700-800 pounds, and they were not particularly easy to move on their own. But per the rules for bolt action, don't have to use a tow, so we'll take it. It's all good. Ambush, I think, is one of the things that these are most useful for, which is good because historically they did a lot of it. That was primarily what their job was. They get the +1 to hit in 3rd edition that applies to ambush, which is really sweet. So you're looking at about 3s to 5s in order to hit, assuming you don't take it in experience, which I never would. It also can easily take advantage of cover, as we talked about just now. They're also an ideal target to kind of have for, kind of like in a nice corridor where a vehicle can't easily move in and out. And the ideal targets they want to shoot at, being vehicles, do have to pivot on their center. So they kind of have to work in relatively open areas, which means that's kind of an ideal place for an AT gun. You don't really want to have to do an advance order. You want to be able to just fire or ambush every single turn. And the result is you have a something that is pretty reasonably effective at ambush. I think it's especially effective against things that are damage value 6 to damage value 8. That 6 to 7 is a really sweet spot. DV6, you're winning on 2s all the time, regardless of range, which is fantastic. So if you're putting them on ambush because you think somebody's going to bring on like a Jeep or a Kettenkrad or something like that with a flamethrower team in them, off of outflank, putting this thing near the edge and just putting them on ambush where they can shoot at it when it comes in would be a really, really sweet idea. Because you're likely to remove the unit. 3s to hit, 2s to wound, which would be pretty sweet. In terms of target priorities, so in light of that, I think you're going to get the most value out of these by doing the following. First of all, shoot at transports. If you can hit a damage value 6 transport, fantastic. 3s to 4s to wound, well, to hit, 2s to wound, you're probably going to get rid of it in a single turn, which is fantastic. Damage value 7 vehicles, slightly harder, but you're still likely to open the can. You've still got about a 50% chance, even at long range, of actually getting to roll on the damage chart, which is good. And your chances of wounding a transport or of pinning a transport are quite high because the number of transports that get to damage value even 8 or 9 is relatively low. Damage value 10 is basically unseen, right? So because of that, it's pretty reliable pin generation, at least on the transport, and thus all the units that are inside of it. So your value has maximized. The number of pins you do each game is increasing because of all the units that are inside. You've also got anti-aircraft vehicles. These are overwhelmingly damage value 6 to 8, and they're often open-topped. Now, you do have some exceptions to this. The Crusader for the British comes to mind. Double light autocannon flak option that's not open-topped. It's pretty dangerous. It's also a really good counter to light AT guns. But, hey, look, there's only so much you can do, man. But, hey, for 50 points, it's not a bad option for at least putting pins on that, right? It's not horrible. So going after anti-aircraft vehicles, probably a good idea. It works okay against light armor. DV7 and DV8, it'll work fine against those. Not necessarily likely to open them up. Definitely not more than 1 per game. But at the very least, it's as good a shot as any as you're going to have. And the value that you're paying for it is going to be pretty good because you can typically buy 2 of these for the same cost as your average damage value 8 vehicle. So it's not horrible. You're also really good against inexperienced infantry. You have a pretty good chance to hit him with that high explosive round, and you're looking at a 2s to wound, which is pretty good for wounding them. So, if you see an inexperienced horde, might not be a bad idea to just load some HE shells and shoot at them, because you might get some value, might get some removal out of it. They're also really good against inexperienced and regular team weapons because you're likely to do 1 to 2 wounds with that 1 inch template. And so, especially those two-man teams, those, bazookas, Piats, light mortar teams, stuff like that, they're not horrible. You're likely to do some wounds. Cover saves may not be so pleasing and may not be so hot for them. And you might even remove the entire team in one go, in which case you've typically paid for yourself. So not particularly bad. That being said, as much as I love these guys, don't think they're particularly great. I think a 35-point light autocannon in general is going to be better. I think a howitzer in general is going to be better because they have more options. Even post the errata, I think the multiple rocket launcher is probably in general a better option. And in general, I would probably even consider leaning into a heavier AT gun. Just go for a medium AT gun if what you're really looking for is unit removal off of a static firing piece. So what would I do to make a change to make these a little more effective and a little more appealing? Okay. First of all, I wouldn't change much. I think that in general, the jump from second to third edition did make them a little better, both because you can take more than one of them, but also because, I mean, they get the benefit to hit. They're going to be doing a little bit better, which I think is good. But a couple of things I would consider doing. First of all, I would give every single light anti-tank gun, not every AT gun, but every light AT gun, the extra selection special rule and let you take 3 of them as a single slot. First of all, because this is traditionally how they were run. They were running groups of 3 to 4. They were spread out along a battle line to provide cover fire against tanks, and they worked as a unit to hunt. That's what they did. And because of that, I think that if you could still take, a couple of AA guns or a rocket launcher, a couple of howitzers, and escort them with some good AT options that are effective against the most common armor you're likely to see on the table, and help to prevent those quick armored transports from which nation or whatever from coming up and doing serious damage, I think that could be a really appealing option. It's a relatively cheap order dice at 50 points in a relatively cheap platoon. So I think in general, that could make it a really good benefit. I also think the gun shield needs to be reworked. I like the idea of it giving you a 5+ save, but I would rather that it also have a special rule that says if you already have a cover save, that it like improves your cover save by 1. Okay, we don't need to make it improve it by 2 or anything like that. It doesn't have to be the same as the down order because technically this unit can still go down, right? So I don't want it to get too crazy. But at the same time, I do think that if you provide something that allows it to stack the gun shield bonus with something else, I think you're going to see it taken more often because you're not overpaying for things when you're providing smart deployment. So I would look into that. And then finally, I would allow AT guns at the start of each turn, if you want to assign them the ambush order. Just right before the turn begins, all of these AT field gun teams, whether it's a light AT gun, medium AT gun, heavy AT gun, super heavy AT gun, let them go on ambush because that is traditionally how they were used. It also means they can't advance, which means as a fixed weapon, they can't change their arc. Getting around them, working around them becomes a little bit easier. So there's a trade-off, not to mention the obvious one, which is you're pulling your order dice out of the bag, right? So like if you really chose to invest heavy, and let's say that you took all 3 of these rules, you implemented them tomorrow, and somebody decided to run like 9 of them, right? They're running like 3 selections of 3, and they spent, including the platoon commander and maybe an AA gun, they've already spent like over, what is that? That's all. Holy cow, that's a lot. That's like over 500 points on your artillery platoon. Even if they decide to put all 9 of them there, they might be taking close to half their dice out of the bag, right? Just to put them all in ambush. And maybe they're effective, maybe they're not, because a unit who's maybe a mortar firing in on them isn't going to trigger an ambush order when it starts the firing and might end up removing them, causing them to go down. There's a lot of stuff that can happen to them before they have to move things in that could potentially trigger the ambush. So, I don't think it would break the rules. I don't think that it would destroy the game to do this sort of stuff. I think it would give them an interesting niche, and I think it would make light AT guns very much more prevalent. And I want them to be a little more prevalent if for no other reason than so many of the starter armies come with one, right? Like the ones that really stood out to me and several that I bought, the American starter army, Winter German starter army, are the ones that came with howitzers. But so many of the starter armies come with light AT guns. So we all basically own them. If you back almost any Kickstarter for any set of 3D files, they almost always come with one of these. So like we're dripping with these, like all over the place. We've got tons of them. And so it'd be really swell, my opinion, if we made them something that was appealing. Do you like these changes? Do you think that this would break the game? Do you think that this seems reasonable? I wouldn't personally change the points cost for them in order to get these benefits. I think these should just be hard baked in. But what do you think? Do you think that maybe makes it a little too crazy? Does this become the new meta? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.